I have somewhere to go, pancakes to eat. We have our first church announcement. We have an update with the Ten Commandment cases, or at least one of them. Nick Fuentes is being himself. And why are people hating on Cracker Barrel? At least their new logo. Let's talk about it. Welcome to The Church, the Court, and the Culture, a podcast dedicated to religion, race, and the law and their intersection in American society. I'm your host, Brooke Gurley. Thank you so much for joining me. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to this podcast. You can subscribe on Substack, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please be sure to follow me on social media. I am at Palooki's World, which should be on the screen. I am there everywhere except on TikTok, where I'm just Palooki. So if you haven't already, please follow me there. Leave me a comment, maybe a suggestion for a topic, whatever it is. I would love to hear from you. All right, now that we have gotten the housekeeping done, like we always have to do at the beginning, let's go right into what I said, the first ever church announcement. Church announcement is we would like to announce the passing of someone within the Christian community, because for me it's always complicated because I'm like, I don't know if we serve in the same God. Nevertheless, someone who is prominent, known as a prominent Christian, and that is James Dobson, who is he was rather a child psychologist turned evangelical proponent of traditional family values. He passed away on August 21st, 2025. I think he was 88. He was up there in age. And so I'm just making this announcement. But as I thought about his passing during this segment of the church, obviously this is dealing with the church, I just thought about the legacy that he had. It was a bit problematic, right? So he's putting forth these traditional family values, but somehow, like all what we're seeing with the Christian right, it is tied into power. Right. So it's really about aligning himself with power and trying to put forth a particular, which is often white, agenda, and using the political structure to do that. And so we know James Dobson, again, as this child psychologist. I think his group, the name of his radio was Focus on the Family. I actually remember when I was a child riding around in my parents' car, and my dad would listen to Focus on the Family and whatever it was. And there's this voice booming through. And just because they were listening to it, it was, some stuff I guess was not all bad, but I think also just kind of hearing what the other side was thinking. But what was interesting, like I said, thinking about his legacy, this is someone who was known for being pro-life or anti-abortion. And that is not something that was always the case with him. So there's a book, when I realized he was passing, there's this book by Randall Balmer called Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. So it just looks at, obviously, the rise of the religious right. But in this book, one thing they look at is the myth, he calls the myth of abortion, and how abortion was really used as a rallying cry for the religious right to get them together by conservatives. They needed this base that was otherwise really not that interested in voting. And so to sort of get them to the polls and get them on their side, they needed a particular topic to rally the troops. And abortion, for whatever reason, sort of stuck, and they went with that. But that wasn't always the case. This idea that being pro-life or anti-abortion being tied into religion was not something that always existed, but is relatively new. And what was interesting in this book, it mentions Dobson in particular, and it says about how he himself, after the passing of Roe, wasn't this gung-ho, we have to fight to reverse this and redeem the family and all these things. His initial thought about this is, and I'll quote, he says, even James Dobson, who later became an implacable foe of abortion, acknowledged in 1973 that the Bible was silent on the matter, and therefore it was plausible for an evangelical to believe that, quote, a developing embryo or fetus was not regarded as a full human being. Now that obviously changed, right? He went from being it's arguable to this is a sin and therefore we have to fight to overturn it, which eventually 50 years later they were successful in overturning Roe. I think that's what he would want his legacy to be a part of. In fact, it is, but it's not actually what he started out believing, or at least having that opinion that it was cut and dry. So again, you wonder what happened. Is this just a change of heart because that happens, or is this again someone trying to align themselves with power and realizing by jumping on this wagon and having a particular view, then you can amass certain power and influence in culture, which of course he would say, yes, I'm trying to have influence in the culture. But I think this is me probably being pessimistic. I think something more nefarious was at stake here, because you have someone saying it's arguable, and now they're saying, or when it was all said and done, this is something that must be done. This is something that God has called us to. But that wasn't his original plan. So there's the issue of abortion, right? You can say flipping on it or changing or bending his position on that. Also, you're fighting to be pro-life, but what are you doing once the child gets here? Are you making these same efforts to provide support to people who need the children? Are you fighting this hard for them? I mean, he would say, yes, I did focus on the family, about restoring the family, but what about people what you have labeled traditional, they don't exist in there and they still need assistance? What about those instances where you're telling people, no, we still want you to have these babies, even though it's not the ideal situation for you? Are you still there walking alongside them? And I think the answer to that question, often in the evangelical circles, is no. We want to, as one person said, they're pro-birth, not necessarily pro-life, because it's not enough that they give birth to the children. What are you doing after the child comes? Are you there to support them? How are you cutting assistance, Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP, all of these things, but then forcing the people to have children? So there has to be a consistency here. Otherwise, you're really just pro-birth, and it's also about just trying to dictate what a woman can and cannot do with her body. Now, like I said, that's abortion. That's his legacy. Then you also have the issue of race, because evangelicalism, particularly white evangelicalism, and as the book says, race and the rise of the religious right, there's always racism undergirding what is going on here too. And that also comes up with Dobson. And Balmer mentions in his book, again, handy dandy, I would highly recommend this. Again, it's Bad Faith, Race, and the Rise of the Religious Right. He mentions that in 2019, Dobson, a group of self-described pro-family leaders, including James Dobson, sent a letter to the Republican leadership of the House of Representatives in defense of Steve King. Steve King was a known racist, or is a known racist, someone who just made these outlandish statements, was very anti-immigrant. He made statements like, we can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies. Who is it? What are you talking about here? King asked white nationalists, white supremacists, Western civilization, how did the language become offensive? So he's putting forth these pro-white nationalist, pro-white supremacist jargon, and he was catching some heat, and people like James Dobson was like, give this man a break. He's a good person. And I think that, again, that too is part of Dobson's legacy. So he's doing all these things to try to help the family, put people together. He has a very particular view on what that means. But undergirding that, there is this flip views, and then there's also racism undergirding. I'm not saying that Dobson was racist. I don't know. But I'm saying he was in support of known racists, and it's just a part of the larger problem with white evangelicalism, which is that racism is there at the core, influencing people, causing them to sort of turn a blind eye to the harm that statements like Steve King made to their fellow, we're supposed to be Christians again, to your fellow Christians. Are you thinking about the harm that those words have, or are you thinking about something else? Again, power, being aligned with power, having proximity to power, that seems to be the objective, and power and influence, that seems to be the objective more so than actually going out and spreading the gospel and loving your neighbor as Christ loves the church. So anyway, that is the church announcement. Dobson, he passed. He has a legacy. It's complicated. It's not all bad, even though I just gave you all kind of the negative things, but I'm sure it's not all bad, but it's problematic, right? I mean, that's just the complexity of all humans. We're not all bad. We're not all good. We are complex, but we can't let the good sort of overshadow the things that we need to talk about, the problematic. But conversely, you can also say we shouldn't let the problematic erode or erase what good is there. But I think that it is important to reflect on the legacy that he left and how he helped push the religious right forward and the problems that remain because of that. All right, now I'm still in the church, right? So that was a church announcement. It's a long church announcement, but that's how church announcements are. I don't know about your church, But some churches I go to, I have seen the announcements linger, and that was what I just did with Dobson. That lingered. But the other thing that I saw, and this could have gone in the church, in the culture, which was Byron Donaldson, who's down in Florida, the person who was set to be the Republican nominee for governor, Black man. He's responding to this change in logo for Cracker Barrel. So I don't know if you all have seen this, but Cracker Barrel is changing its logo and its decor inside. It's just very, their decor was very old school. Like probably I couldn't go into the store if I existed during this time period. I'd be called girl or whatever, just like all these. I might get lynched if I did something crazy in the store. That's what it was giving. And they've been doing some rebranding. Why? I don't know. I mean, part of it is they're just trying to rebrand. So they got rid of the old man on the logo and just have Cracker Barrel. And then even inside of it, they have updated it. And so people are upset about this. And Byron Donaldson is one of them. And he did a tweet. And I just think like, sir, you're doing too much with this tweet. You're doing too much where he said, I'm just going to quote, he said, in college, I worked at Cracker Barrel in Tallahassee. I even gave my life to Christ in the parking lot. Their logo was iconic, and their unique restaurants were a fixture of American culture. No one asked for this. Well, rebrand. It's time to make Cracker Barrel great again. Now, there's so much going on in this tweet. There's this conflation of Christ, right? Like Cracker Barrel is so quintessential America. It is also something so quintessential religious. There's American religion caught up in that. And to get rid of this sign that, like I said, it's problematic. Like, it's an era that was kind of cool, but then also very racist. And like, we might get lynched. Like Byron, you might have gotten in trouble if you walked into a store like this during the time that it existed. You may not even been able to go into a store like this. But for him to erase what he sees as erasing this period that's problematic and connecting that to his faith, I think is a problem. It's the conflation of America and Christianity happening in this tweet. He is saying that to get rid of that is almost, he's not saying explicitly, but he's likening it to getting rid of God, to removing Christ. Like so much happened. This wasn't just a place where he worked. This was a sacred space, because this type of America, the Make America Great era, is sacred. It is holy, and the woke left is eroding that and taking away the sacred space. That's absolutely ridiculous. It's a restaurant. I mean, I think it's great that you gave your life to Christ whenever you said you did, but it's not tied into the parking lot of Cracker Barrel, if that is happening. Although I would love to hear the story, but it's more than, that's something separate. But to think that you need this type of store, this type of restaurant, this type of branding in order for America to be great, in order for Cracker Barrel to be great, I think it's just ridiculous. It also just speaks to how he's trying to tap into this religious right? So he's trying to tap into what Randall is talking about, or Balmer is talking about in his book. I don't even know if he truly believes it. Maybe he does. But I think he's just trying to send these, not even dog whistles at this point, it's just a straight up whistle saying, I'm going to attack this as being anti-woke. It couldn't just possibly be that maybe we wanted to rebrand, right? Because we just thought it's time to rebrand. The stores aren't doing what they need to do. We want to appeal to a wider audience. It has to be this attack on America, attack on religion. Again, although the attack on religion is not explicit in his statement, it is there. He is implying that in his statements. And so it's just kind of a ridiculous, I think it's an absolute ridiculous tweet to put out there. Just say you're upset about the logo. I understand it, but to tie it also obviously into Make America Great Again, Make Cracker Barrel Great Again, it's tapping into MAGA, it's tapping into everything that they loathe, they hate. He's giving them the meat, dog whistles that he's hoping will rally the base, because like I said, he's trying to be the next governor of the state of Florida. But I'm not in Florida, but if I was, again, I would not vote for him. This is a joke, and this is the kind of messaging, this is the type of governor that you'll get. So keep that in mind, Florida. If he actually gets to the ballot like that, is this someone who you want who's just going to give you fodder and not actually give you substance and make false conflations? Think about it. All right. Let me know what you think, though. Leave me a comment. Maybe you're thinking, yes, this is about being woke and it's crazy. Bring back that man in the Cracker Barrel logo. This is all about being America. They are attacking us. In the age of Trump, somehow they still are attacking you. I don't know. Let me know. Leave me a comment. All right, now that we've done the church, we have church announcements. We did a brief thing about Byron and Cracker Barrel and how he's likening Cracker Barrel to a church, basically, like this sacred space. Let's get into the court, right? Court and religion. And we have a court update with one of these 10 Commandment cases. So in Texas, a judge in the Western District of Texas temporarily blocked the display of the 10 Commandments in Texas public schools. So this was set to go into effect September 1st, where all schools had to display, all classrooms had to display the 10 Commandments in their classrooms. Not talk about it, not necessarily do anything about it, but they had to display the 10 Commandments. As you can imagine, other people filed lawsuits asking for this to be blocked, that they would not have this. This is a clear violation of the First Amendment, and the court entered a temporary restraining order saying, yeah, no, y'all not going to do this. So they're still litigating the case, but for now they're saying you cannot put this up starting September 1st until this thing gets worked out. As you can imagine, proponents of the 10 Commandments see this as just sort of overstepping the bounds. For them, I think Ken Paxton is the state attorney general, and he's the one representing, saying that the 10 Commandments should be displayed. For him, he says the 10 Commandments are the cornerstone of our moral and legal heritage. He vowed to appeal the decision. He said this is nothing more than just sort of, I guess they're trying to position it as an ode to our legal heritage, and that no one is forced to do anything. There's no coercion. It's just there on display. If people want to talk about it, they can talk about it. The judge in this case disagreed. He's like, listen, if it was just, don't steal, don't kill, all those things maybe, but you have things like adultery. What does that have to do with like just general principles? And those may not be topics that a parent wants their child to deal with at this age. And so even though it's up there passively, it may spark an interest in the child that the parent does not want them to discuss or deal with at this point, which I think is actually an interesting argument, because a lot of on the right, when they're sort of talking out against LGBTQ being pushed in school, they mention how that's a topic that they don't want their children to be exposed to. They want to be able to tell that. So the judge here is sort of taking that same kind of logic and saying, yeah, and the same thing goes with what's in the 10 Commandments. Maybe they don't want their kids to learn about what adultery is, and they want to deal with those types of things just yet. And so the parent should have the ability to control that. The logic should hold, if one's arguing one way, it should go both ways, but we'll see what happens with that. Like I said, Ken Paxton said he is vowing to appeal this case. Now, other similar statutes have been struck down by the Fifth Circuit, and Arkansas tried that. It was also struck down. And the Fifth Circuit was out of Louisiana where they struck that down. And for me, this begs the question, and here's sort of the upshot of all this. It begs the question of, why are they pushing these laws that, in my opinion, and I think anybody watching would say, these are blatantly unconstitutional, right? You have the 10 Commandments posted on in classrooms, posted at schools, so that they have to be displayed. Like, they're not supposed to be just like off to the side, but they need to be displayed in a way that people can see it. How is that not a violation of the Constitution? Why are you putting this up there? And I think the reason is because they believe they have a sympathetic Supreme Court. Now, why do they have this sympathetic Supreme Court? I think because the current trajectory of the court leads them to believe that such displays may in fact be ruled constitutional. So you have, starting with like Hobby Lobby, all the way to the big one is Kennedy versus Remington, where the coach is on the sideline praying, and the court said, listen, this is what he's doing in his quiet time. It's not coercive. They could join him, but they didn't have to join him. There's no issue here. And you also have a similar case with the 10 Commandments being sort of passive monuments in Texas. I'm forgetting the case, but it's Perry. Governor Perry was one of the parties, but where these are just seen as passive monuments. So they're not meant to be a violation of the First Amendment, because they're just like, they're monuments like any other kind of monument. Of course, saying those are passive. They're not putting forth any particular religious statement. And I think that the people who are putting these 10 commandments in the classroom, they know they're probably going to be ruled unconstitutional at this level. They don't care about that. They're trying to get to the Supreme Court so they can further push this Christian right agenda by putting these overtly and patently religious documents within the public space in ways that they should not be. And so it'll be interesting to see if this goes to the Supreme Court. And if it does, will the Supreme Court try to figure out a way to further craft precedent in a way that would allow for this to be displayed in a classroom? Because it seems like it should be ruled unconstitutional, and it seems like it should be blatantly unconstitutional for everyone, anyone looking at this. But I don't think, I think that they're doing it because they want to get to the court so that they can actually flip it. They're doing all these things because they want to overturn precedent. A lot of it that comes out of the Warren Court of the 60s, which you have, civil rights movement happens, Brown, all the way to Roe, all these things, Warren and Burger Court, they want to overturn some of these major precedents. They feel like go contrary to traditions, historical practices, to what happened before. So I think that's what's going on. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on here. They want to go to the Supreme Court. I will keep an eye on that. You all keep an eye on that as well. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think this will get to the court? And if so, do you think the court will rule in their favor? Finally, we are at the culture. Now this, I could actually turn into a whole podcast series. So I'm going to try to keep it short. And just like give you the bullet points here. And that is, I saw a clip of Nick Fuentes, a racist, a known racist, white supremacist, having an interview with the Candace Owens, the one that's getting sued by the First Lady of France, that Candace Owens. And in the clip, he's essentially arguing that the issue with Black people, why we're so problematic, prone to criminality, essentially, and can't get it right, is because there's something intrinsic with us. And then he goes on to say how, if you look at Africa before the white people came, we had no language, we had no two-story buildings. Basically, we were just roaming around doing unga bunga, I guess. I don't know. He said, and then Candace, for all it's worth, she did interject and say, well, Egypt, you mentioned Egypt being progressive, having culture, Egypt's in Africa. And he tries to separate this. It's like, well, that's different. They're racially different from sub-Saharan Africa. And he goes on to make the point, and he's like, and this is how it goes into this podcast. It's like, but, I'm Catholic, so I don't think that anything is truly immutable, basically, that there can be change, and we are able to change. And so through generations, Black people can become better and more developed, but just intrinsically now we are not. Like I said, there's so much to unpack here. I'm just going to try to hit some of the high points. One, using religion to justify or to excuse all of this racism at the end, saying, but it's fine because I'm Catholic and I think they can change. It's disgusting. Okay. Because we are all made in the image of God. That's what it says, right? We are created in the image of God. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. It does not distinguish between particular races, right? It doesn't say that the Black people accept them, they're not. But the white people, they are. Side note, white people aren't even mentioned in the Bible, right? These are, let me be more specific, European countries are not mentioned in the Bible until you get to the New Testament or the Second Testament, right? When you get with Paul and his epistles. The vast majority of the Bible happens in Africa and Asia, right? The land where he just disparaged and said, oh, they didn't have any written language. Now, that said, there's some points that he makes that are just wrong. First, let's talk about this idea of sub-Saharan Africa. That terminology is problematic because that is relatively new. Like that didn't exist. That's not how they actually oriented themselves or saw themselves. That is something that is a vestige of colonialism, and it appears in the 1950s is when it starts to really hit and enter into the American lexicon. And it's a way to replace the term tropical Africa or Black Africa that was formerly used. So it's supposed to be a less racially tinged word, but it's still based in the legacy of colonialism. And it's a way for them colonial for whites to separate the clear civilization that they cannot deny that happens in Egypt from the rest of Africa. So it's a way of trying to whiten the civilized, what they cannot deny are the civilized parts of Africa, and sort of demonize the rest of Africa. But even if you do that, because obviously Egypt is a part of Africa, and it has a very rich legacy, history. It has the things that Fuentes claims that the rest of Africa does not have. But he also says that Egypt is racially different than the rest of Africa. That's true now, but that wasn't always the case. And if you look at the history, the first pharaoh of Egypt, the one who united Upper and Lower Egypt, Namur, he was a black man, right? If you go back and look at the images, he's a black man who united Egypt into the great empire that it became. And then you also had different ethnicities roaming or ruling within Egypt over the different dynasties. So for example, you had a period where the Kushites were black and their kingdom expanded into Sudan, which I'll get to a little later. They ruled for, I think, about 500 years in Egypt during one of the 25th dynasty. And so it goes back and forth, and you did have Arabs coming in, and you have people who are mixed race coming in, but to say that they're ethnically different than the rest of Africa is just wrong. It's historically inaccurate. I dare say it's a lie that he knows he's telling something that is not true. And so Egypt is Africa. Egypt is part of Africa. Africa clearly had language and culture long before Europeans were doing anything, before they even had a civilization. Africa had civilization. You have Anaptoplia, which was this place where you can tell that they were doing astronomy, using the stars to dictate the times, the seasons of the year. That's out in the Sahara Desert. You have actually more pyramids in Sudan than you do in Egypt. Again, the sub-Saharan part of Africa, even that part, had and has culture. You also have in Ethiopia, you had the Kingdom of Aksum, which existed at least around 322 AD, which has their own legacy within their own tradition. They related back to King Azana, but they connected to the Davidic line, where Queen Sheba met with Solomon. They had a child, and that child went on to Ethiopia. So they are part of the Davidic line within their tradition. But what is undeniable is that they had this mighty king of Aksum, which traded with the East, had a great rich kingdom that traded with the East. They have their own language, Ge'ez or Ge'ez, that still exists. They have the whole book of Enoch, which is completely in Ge'ez or Ge'ez. So there's language, there's written language, there's culture that exists even in the sub-Saharan Africa. So this idea that the missionaries came over and saw nothing is just a lie, right? It's not that they didn't see anything, they didn't report back anything, and nobody knows about it because they don't teach us in school, because they want people to come to the conclusion, like Fuentes, that Africa had no language, had no culture. It was just a bunch of people roaming around in the jungle going oonga boonga. That's a lie. He also says that most people currently in sub-Saharan Africa have IQs in the 70s, which in other words is like what I think that is developmentally delayed. It's slow, not smart. But even that one, I don't even know what data do you have to support that. I think you're just making that up. You're pulling out of your behind. Furthermore, the IQ test is very problematic, right? So it starts with Francis Galton, who's the cousin of Darwin, Charles Darwin, evolution, but Galton's also the father of eugenics. They created a test to prove the superiority of white people. And oh my gosh, it proves the superiority of white people. It's like, is it that the test is objective in proving something that is objective, or is it that the test is subjective and set out to prove a subjective belief? And so the results are subjective and not to be trusted. So this idea that you have the IQs, again, I think he's just making that up. That alone is not enough to prove anything, because the test itself was created for a racist purpose. And the fact that it proves the racist purpose intended means nothing. And it also, Fuentes completely ignores the reality of how one's environment dictates sort of the things that they're capable of having access to and therefore achieving. Not that they're limited, they can never go beyond that. But when you deny people education, right, make it illegal like they did in this country, and then turn around and say that they're dumb, it's like, well, are they dumb, or is it that you are keeping them intentionally ignorant? So they are just this is just the fruits of your own labor, right? So what happens if you actually have everything equal? You'll find out that the people who you think are dumb are not dumb at all. They're probably smarter than you. It's the same thing, this whole idea with eugenics. It's the idea of the people who, this person was a drunkard, their father was a drunkard, the whole family was a drunkard. No one's looking at the fact that, well, they were all poor and this may be the coping mechanisms that they're using, or they're all suffering from something else. There's just a total lack of accountability for the society that produces a population of people who are struggling. And so instead of just sort of dealing with the inequalities built into the system that allows for this type of behavior where people who are poor are forced to do things that maybe they wouldn't do if they had enough money, or just don't have access to resources like education. So obviously if they don't have access to education the same way the rich, they're not going to have the same knowledge level. They're not going to do as well on the IQ test. And it's not a matter of innate ability or what's intrinsic, as Fuentes says. I mean, after all, Trump went to UPenn. That's the Ivy League. You can't tell me that that man is smarter, that he earned it. Like, I'll hear him speak. This man is not smart, but he's rich. He has resources, so he makes it there. And this idea that some people are just intrinsically, the whole race of people are just intrinsically bad, just denies accountability to the ruling class and how they subjugate people and keep them in place and keep them with these lower IQs. Instead, it blames the victim. It blames those who are subjugated for their subjugation. It's crazy. And he knows that. He knows that. Fuentes knows that. That's why he was scrolling around in that interview. But you may be saying, why? What's the upshot of this? Why are you telling this? I think this is so important. This is why we have to resist this erasure of Black history. So we've already had a lot of our history erased that we're uncovering now. Right, like our history does not begin in slavery. It begins in Africa, but most of the time when you think about Black history, it starts in slavery. But we were not slaves. This is like really just a blip in the history of Black people. We started out in Africa, but all of that history, a lot of that history has been erased. So it's important that what we do have, that we keep it going. You have Trump working hard to remove any vestige, any memory of slavery in the museums. They don't want to teach it. And why is that? It's because so that when people like Nick Fuentes says the foolishness that he says, people just accept it as truth, right? Because they don't know anything else. They're not taught anything else. If he says that Black people had no culture, well, I didn't learn about it in school, so it has to be true. But it's a lie. And it's a lie that happens because we are the country is trying to intentionally bury the history that we have. And we cannot let this happen, right? Just because we think we've made progress does not mean we cannot go backwards. We, as I said last week, we are in the period that is right after Reconstruction. Very similar. You even have Representative Nicole Collier, who was locked in the Texas House, unable to move, roam about. It's like slave pass. It's like, what is happening here? We are going backwards. And you have crazy people like Nick Fuentes saying we had no culture, so what we have now is progress. We're intrinsically problematic. But, I do believe in God that can change. It just will take generations. We are in a very dangerous time. And the erasure of history is intentional, and it's something that we have to resist, because the erasure is not just about erasing us, but it's also about how they get to subjugating us completely. And we cannot let that happen. I cannot stress this enough. We cannot let that happen. All right, that's it for now. I do have a book that I'm reading, but I haven't finished it yet, so I can't quite give the recommendation, but stay tuned. It's a beautiful book thus far. I'm enjoying it. And you're like, what book is it? I'll let you know next week. If you have any book recommendations, please let me know. I love books. I love reading all types of books. I really love, I'm into fiction and fantasy, sci-fi and fantasy books, and Afrofuturistic books as well. So if you know of any great ones, please send them my way. Again, If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to this podcast on Substack, Apple, or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please be sure to follow me. I am at Paluki's World, which is on the screen everywhere except TikTok. I am just Paluki. Until next time, you all be blessed and be safe. Peace.